we're alone in the universe. Pretty much as soon as we understood that Earth is a planet orbiting a star, and there's lots of stars out there, there's probably planets. Is there life on those worlds? And yet, I think back in the '60s, '70s, the question about whether we should be searching for life on other worlds wasn't considered cool, man. Um, what what sort of shifted in the sort of scientific thinking that said, okay, wait a minute, let's start thinking about what life might look like in worlds other than Earth?
Yeah, so I'll actually take the story back a little bit before that even, because it has been all of human history over millennia. We've been thinking about like these big questions, like why are we here? What is life? Are we alone? Like those are humongous questions that we've applied philosophy and religion and science and all these other ways of thinking to try to figure out like big questions about our existence. But in the late 1800s, this guy, Percival Lowell, who I'm sure your audience knows about, was turned into an astronomer because of his own passion. Started using his telescope in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is now the Lowell Observatory, to look at Mars, and he thought he saw canals, and he wrote a book in 1895 suggesting that there was an advanced civilization on Mars who were irrigating water from the poles to the equator. Then wrote The War of the Worlds 2 years later, and like this whole realm of alien invasion sci-fi started. And like just last night, I was watching an old MST3K episode from the 1950s where they're watching like an old movie. It was pretty well known in the Western world in the early parts of the 1900s, especially the 1930s, 1940s, early 1950s, that we weren't alone. It was just people just knew that aliens were out there. Mars had little green men. Venus had little green men. The planets were inhabited. And then it shifted. So like we weren't alone. There were aliens. There were humanoids and all these other planets around us. And then we started going out into the cosmos with spacecraft and exploring. Famously, Mariner 4, the very first flyby, Mariner 9, the first spacecraft to orbit around the planet, both going to Mars, showed us that Mars kind of appeared to be rather dead from the outside. It didn't look like there were giant forests, as some have predicted, or ancient civilizations like remnants of buildings and giant ape people walking around because they lost their technology. And so a lot shifted, and for a little bit there was a period where, okay, Mars is dead, chances are the rest of the solar system's dead. It's just life here. At that same time, people were thinking actively about what's possible beyond our solar system, what's possible for alien life. And then you're right, like, there was this big shift. So in the late 60s, kind of early 70s, a bunch of things started happening scientifically that kind of changed our thinking a lot. Amongst those things, one of them was the discovery of hydrothermal vents on the seafloor in the late 70s. 1977, the very first human team went down and saw one of these giant black smokers where seawater goes down into the ocean crust, gets warmed up by the mantle, and when it comes back out, it's enriched in metals and a lot of the chemistry of life. And so it built these giant columns, and they found these huge tube worms and albino crabs and all kinds of things thriving in a place on Earth that we thought was dead. And so that was one of those moments where it's like, oh, we thought this was dead. Life couldn't be here. So maybe if we think Mars or other worlds are dead and life can't be there, maybe it actually could be. We're just not looking in the right way. We had a few other similar events. So finding extremophiles in those kinds of environments. One of the big ones was finding geothermal pools like in Yellowstone and discovering that there were many microbes surviving these super high temperatures around these geothermal springs and volcanic regions. And applying that to like aerobiology, finding out that there's a bunch of stuff that just like survives being lofted into the atmosphere and you can collect it. All of those things coming together, and then also the discovery of the tree of life. Using phylogenetics to show that all the archaea, bacteria, all the Euryarchaeota, that we're all connected through this large tree of life, and we can show that using our genes and our DNA. It gave us this idea that we can use a tool, a common tool in biology, to explore the history of life on Earth. Maybe if we can find molecules for information or metabolism or structure that alien life was using, maybe we could also understand its history as well. And then, of course, by the 1990s, things really started kicking off with the discovery of exoplanets, which has really opened things up a lot more now. And so it's been this large kind of up and down meandering of, we have to be alone, there could be alien life, maybe we're not alone, and kind of just working its way around. And now we're at this place where it really feels like if we're not alone, and it's still a big if, but it feels very much like we're not. But if we're not alone, it feels like we must be getting close.
mean, it's, with those discoveries of the life around the hydrothermal vents and extremophiles and huddled up inside nuclear reactors, and just like it goes on, that things sort of switched. That now, if you find water anywhere on Earth, it's surprising if there's not life.
Yeah.
It's everywhere, right?
Yeah, and even places that are kind of dry too. So like tardigrades, these little water bears who are kind of like the rock stars of the extremophile realm, they can survive desiccation, like losing most of their body's moisture, and just be like this little compacted glob of cells. And then as soon as they get some water again, they can just kind of fluff back up and come back to life. It's incredible.
Yeah, yeah. And so now when you think about the presence of water, like was that the second part of it? Was the discovery of liquid water across the solar system?
And that's been pretty big. For Mars, for instance, we can have these discoveries of water on Mars and keep having them over and over again, which is kind of silly. We know that Mars had a wet past. It had a lot of water at some point, maybe even had an ocean, certainly had lakes and rivers. We can see that in just the geological formations of river deltas and the structures of canyons that have been eroded by the action of water. You can see where water sat in lakes inside of craters. NASA for a while in the astrobiology program had this vision of like follow the water was the term. That if we follow the water, there's a better potential for finding signs of life. But then we also have some other systems where maybe it's not necessarily just water, but having a solvent of some kind for metabolism to happen could be important. So like Titan, for instance, around Saturn, most likely doesn't have any kind of life as we know it at the surface. It is extremely cold, but it's still an interesting place to study an environment where there's a different kind of solvent as the liquid medium that could be possible for life to thrive in.
So, I mean, this story of following the water, NASA backed this up with a series of missions. You've got Spirit, Opportunity, you've got Curiosity, and most recently you have Perseverance. And yet the spacecraft have not had, these rovers have not had the ability to find life in the way that if I gave you a drop of pond water for your microscope, you'd be able to find examples of it. So, where are we at in matching the type of science that needs to be done with the capabilities of the missions that are actually being sent out into the universe?
Yeah, this is a really great question because, early on, we kind of thought that Mars was going to have life. Even after the Mariners, we discovered that Mars looked barren. When we sent the Viking landers, it was still kind of thought maybe there could be some of the kinds of life, like microbes that we have on Earth that could be on Mars. And so the Viking landers had these biology experiments on board that very much could look for things like photosynthesis of modern organisms or things that have to break down organic matter and use it for their own building up their cells and then respire CO2 the way that we do. And one of those experiments did have questionable results. Most in the scientific community feel like it was a negative result. But Gil Levin, who led the experiment, the labeled release experiment, Gil Levin, who passed away a few years ago now, he spent the entire rest of his life feeling that he had found life on Mars with this experiment. But I think in general the consensus is that we just can't say yes or no on that one. It's interesting though, we've never actually sent a similar experiment back again to look for respiration or autotrophy, basically these different ways that life as we know it gets its energy and lives. But we have had these more recent rovers, so like Curiosity. Part of Curiosity's mission very much was to look for possible ancient environments that could have life, so ancient habitable environments for life on Mars. And then within Curiosity's or Perseverance's mission plan actually is searching for biosignatures. And on board it has, my favorite tool is the Raman spectrometer. It has many great instruments, but the Raman spectrometer in particular could find organic matter that could be a biosignature, a sign of either past or maybe even present life in some of the samples from Mars. And then with Perseverance, we're also caching a bunch of samples that some people are really hoping we can bring back to Earth to do more research with that could also have diagnostic signs of life as well. And so we are slowly kind of getting back to it. I think one of the issues with sending instruments like we had on Viking is that they are very, very specific to one kind of metabolism or one kind of life, whereas a lot more of the current research is looking for what people call agnostic biosignatures. So things that could be signs of life, even if it's not Earth life. And so trying to be more open-minded to what kinds of molecules, what kinds of metabolisms an alien life might have, and also being receptive to lots of different ways of looking so that we're not, putting, $1 billion into one instrument that can only look for one single kind of life. We feel right now like it's better to kind of like stretch our net as wide as possible. But who knows, in the future, we might have some kind of indicator and then send back some very specific instrument too.
Yeah, and that's what I feel is like Perseverance does have like the highest resolution. It's not exactly a microscope, but it's a very advanced lens that can see, magnify objects that are very small. And as you said, it has a mass spectrometer, it has a bunch of other systems on board, and it's collecting those core samples and holding them carefully for a future sample return mission. But and there's this lag between what is the hardware that has actually been deployed and what is the state of the art that astrobiologists are thinking about for doing the next level of the research. And so, you sort of got these two main pathways available to you. One is bring those samples home, put them in the lab, and let the world's greatest scientists with the world's greatest labs really comprehensively check these exquisitely chosen samples for signs of life. The other option is send a more capable instrument to Mars. Do you think that the scientific community has settled on which of those pathways is probably going to be more effective?
I don't think so, and this is going to be contentious because I have a lot of friends who work on Mars sample return, who work for NASA, and there very much is a big push right now to get Congress's support to get those samples back to Earth and do the research. But I personally, for myself, and I know I'm not alone in this, there are many in the field who feel this way, that we really could maybe do it better and faster if we just sent humans to Mars and sent some higher end instruments. You send a geochemist to Mars, that person can do more in 1 week than most of what our rovers can do in many months or a year. Because the rovers, they have to move a little slower. We have to look at the rocks from afar here on Earth with the rover trying to help us. Of course, our technology for automation is changing, and so in the near future, we're probably going to have robots sent out into space on our behalf that have a lot more automation on board, that have their own machine learning processes, their own AI on board that helps them make determinations on the fly about what samples to take and what data to send home. But even with that, I still think there's a big push from many of us to get humans kind of moving faster, moving further, and getting out to places like Mars where we can do a lot of work. And so, no offense to my friends on Mars sample return, I think those samples are really awesome, and I'd love to get them back. But at a certain point, we have to start weighing the costs, the trade-offs of how much money do we put into developing the infrastructure for Mars sample return versus how much money should we put into the infrastructure for getting higher-end instruments to space, getting them through the whole process of being flight ready and allowed to go to space is big, but then also getting humans out there using those instruments would also be a really big push for me as well.
But I mean, every part of a human mission is a scaled-up version of a Mars sample return mission. You're sending a spacecraft to Mars. You're landing safely on the surface of Mars. You are doing stuff. You are then ascending back to orbit, meeting with a return vehicle, returning back to Earth, landing safely somewhere. It's the whole same process. I wouldn't feel comfortable sending a crew of humans until a Mars sample return mission had been completed, just because it's the same job, just scaled up. And Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's true. And then humans coming back would most likely bring samples back the same way the Apollo astronauts brought a lot of moon rocks back. We have so many great rocks, and some still haven't been touched. We've been spending decades studying these samples they brought back. I was very fortunate. One of my office mates years ago in grad school, she had some of the Apollo 15 lunar rocks in our office, and it was just so cool to hang out and see them as she was taking them to the lab and go do work. And it's pretty awesome. And so any human mission to Mars most certainly would be bringing Mars rocks back as well. And probably high quality Mars rocks. So you get a geologist. So for instance, for the moon, the best rocks that came back from the moon came from the one geologist we sent. And so with Mars, send the geologist who knows what they're collecting. They're going to bring back some really awesome rocks, and maybe rocks that we couldn't get, from Mars sample return from Perseverance right now. But yeah, it would be awesome to have those samples back. Plus, there are things we can do in our laboratories on Earth that almost no human mission is ever going to do on Mars, at least not any time in our lifetimes or next few generations. So using synchrotron particle accelerators, for instance, these are gigantic instruments, $1 trillion instruments with humongous facilities where we use high energy X-rays to study the mineral chemistry of the rock samples in high resolution and map them out in nanometer scales and things like that. And we're not going to build that into a human laboratory on a Mars lander at least not anytime soon.
And the other thing that I like about the lunar samples was a lot of it was put into cold storage with the assumption that better technology would be around the corner into the future. And what do you know? Better technology has come along, and they keep unfreezing samples and using the latest version of the state of the art. And whenever there's a step upgrade in what humanity can learn from the rocks, they make a few more available while keeping the rest in store, waiting for that future. I'm assuming the same thing would happen with Mars. I mean, when you send your probe, when you send your robot to the surface of Mars or your lab or whatever, you're sort of saying this is it. This is the best technology that we're capable of sending today to examine the samples. Having them back at home would allow you to test out into the future.
Yeah. But it is a lot to design and develop those still. Like we don't have the infrastructure in place yet from our sample return. And so it will be a large undertaking bringing these samples home. And then, a lot of people are wondering, like, how we're going to analyze them here on our. Does it go to a BSL like level 4 lab first? Do we build a new laboratory just for Mars samples? So there's a lot of questions yet about the whole infrastructure we have to build around getting those samples home. And so, currently with where Congress is at, Mars sample return hasn't been canceled necessarily yet, but they've been basically told that they have to figure out how to do this infrastructure within a very specific amount of money, which is not a lot of money in the way things work in space exploration. And so it is a challenge right now for my friends and colleagues in the Mars sample return realm. We're trying to figure out how we can get the money allocated and maybe even increase that money to get those samples back.
Well, don't worry, we're not constrained by any of that pesky realism here in this conversation. We will let our imagination fly free to what's possible. So then, you mentioned briefly that there's this idea of sort of agnostic methods of searching for life. So can you give me some examples, like how does an agnostic method compare to one that is searching for a much more well-known method?
Yeah, a great example is the Viking biology experiments. So it's something like labeled release, like we're giving a nutrient broth, a very specific number of nutrients to the soil in the hopes that maybe some microbes who eat those kinds of nutrients the same way that we do will then break them down and respire a radio-labeled carbon inside of the nutrients as carbon dioxide. And so it would happen to us. If we took radio-labeled Snickers bar and fed it to a human, you would eventually breathe out CO2 that's radio-labeled as well. And so we know that you consumed that piece. But it's very specific to a very singular approach to biology. Of eating certain kinds of organic molecules, breaking them down, and respiring CO2. But then more agnostic methods would maybe look, instead of like feeding a broth and hoping that it eats that broth, would be looking for all the kinds of amino acids we can find in a sample, or all just the organic structures you can find inside of a sample. So a mass spectrometer is one of the best tools for that. There's different ways to break down the material and then to analyze it in the mass spectrometer, and then we can kind of rebuild from there to figure out what the organic molecules that are present were. That gives us a much better idea, just in general, of like the chemistry of the sample, of the environment, and whether or not those organic molecules may have been produced by life. Right now there's folks like Lee Cronin and Sarah Walker who are working on this idea called the assembly theory, where they have this idea, of the steps it takes to build up from very simple, basic building blocks, atoms to molecules, and building larger and larger molecules that life uses. That we can kind of trace back through the pathway of all the steps necessary to get to building something very complex, and that there might be like a window where life itself is kind of diagnostic because it take a lot of steps in a very specific kind of pathway to get to these more complex organics. But also things like Raman spectrometers and infrared spectrometers are really great just for giving us an idea of the organic chemistry present. When it comes to things like DNA, we could send an instrument out into space to Mars or into the ocean of Europa to try to look for DNA and maybe even look for genes, but that would be very, very specific to life as we know it. It's quite possible that alien life out there doesn't even use DNA, or if it did for some reason also come upon using RNA and DNA like we do, it might not use the same bases. So DNA has 4 nitrogenous bases that link together inside of this long double helix. It might be possible alien life using DNA uses different bases. Or even if it uses the same bases, which would be kind of remarkable, it might not use the same coding. So the way DNA works for life as we know it, every 3 bases come together as one single code for one amino acid, with a little bit of wobble room in the back. So some of them get coded by multiple 3 codons, we call them, 3 amino acids together, to get to that point of having DNA with the same bases we have, with the same coding structure, and then if it's using the same kinds of genes that we have, that almost demands that it's also life as we know it, and we have a shared origin, or it's contamination. If it's truly alien life, there's a good chance it's either not going to use DNA, or it's going to use DNA in a much different way.
So let's imagine a blank slate, and you sort of have knowledge about all of the different places in the solar system that are interesting to astrobiologists. If you could sort of make a priority, and again, budget is no object here, where would you love to start? If either to crew of astronauts or have a sample returned, no matter how if you want something from the core of the sun, we got you. But
those are all like different questions though, and I'll even throw in time. So if time weren't a factor, say we have a time machine, say we can somehow like get like a spaceship DeLorean and we can travel back in time in the solar system. My favorite planet for possible life besides Earth in our solar system is Venus very early on. And so Mars was much colder early on. It definitely had water. It probably had a much thicker atmosphere. It could have been a great place for life, but I think Venus was probably the better candidate early on. Venus, we think, might have had an atmosphere much like Earth's now, might have had oceans. It's very similar in size to the Earth. It just underwent some different geological history than we have. It didn't have a nice moon stabilizing it like we have. It's now going through this runaway greenhouse effect, so the atmosphere is super thick and the surface is super hot. It appears like the entire surface melted maybe 500 million to 1 billion years ago. We don't quite know why yet. That all happened. Maybe it didn't have plate tectonics, so everything got stuck in place and then just melted and kind of like flipped over and the whole surface melted out. And so maybe there aren't any signs of life remaining on Venus from those early periods because of that. But I really do love that we had that that recent potential finding of phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus, and it kind of got people interested in Venus again, and makes us want to send some more missions back. We've had so few missions to Venus, we need more. And even though I'm kind of skeptical that we're going to find signs of alien life in the clouds of Venus and its atmosphere, it's still worth looking. So that'd be a great place to go early in the solar system history to see if life was unfolding there. If we're sending humans out, I think Mars is the best option. Beyond the moon, going out past our magnetic field and getting out into our solar system, Mars has a nice rocky surface. We know that humans could land there and support a habitat there. People have done a really great work showing that we could use the Martian atmosphere and the Martian regolith, the soil of Mars, as resources, as building materials, to make rocket fuel, to make breathable oxygen and water. There's so many resources on Mars for supporting human life. And then when it comes to just looking for alien life in general, if life can start in oceans, and we don't know yet if it can or not, there are some debates right now about whether or not life started on Earth in the ocean versus on the surface or came from somewhere else. But if life can start in oceans, then maybe worlds like Europa and Enceladus are really the places we should be getting to as fast as possible to go look for life.
So let's say that your time machine crew returns and they've got a sample from early Venus, or the Europa crew returns. You've got these samples, and in one sort of outcome, it does have DNA, and feels very similar. I think are the implications compared to the one where it is clearly not the same kind of biological structure as Earth life.
Yeah, in that case, it almost feels like it has to be a shared origin. Now, like alien life there might be like an imperative, like a biological drive to use DNA for information in the universe. That's quite possible. But again, if we find like a sample from early Venus or a sample from Mars now, and it has what appears to be life, like the signs of life, and included in those signs are DNA, and it's DNA that uses the same 4 bases as us, and maybe has a similar code of the codons, that would almost suggest we have some kind of shared origin very early in our history. Now, I love the idea of panspermia, the seeds everywhere, that life could be raining down on early Earth from from Venus, maybe we're Venusians, or maybe we're Martians, and maybe life started on Mars and then came here. However, it does seem like life started here on Earth at some point very early in our history. And so it almost feels like life kicked off as soon as it possibly could on Earth. I'm not quite sure why yet that happened. But all the processes for life that have started maybe on Mars or Venus first and then come here, it's not impossible. It's just the window of time for that to have happened before life has taken hold here seems very, very small.
And for the other way, if it turns out to be completely unrelated to Earth life, what are the implications for that, do you think?
Alien, wildly alien. And it could use an entirely different information system. There are people out there who've been looking into different of molecules that might serve in the kinds of ways that RNA and DNA have. Right now, a lot of people think that maybe early in Earth's life's history, that RNA was the key molecule, that RNA, some great researchers have shown over the years that RNA can catalyze reactions. So it doesn't just store information the way DNA does, but RNA also can drive forward reactionary processes that could be the earliest metabolisms themselves were being done by RNA. It was storing the information for how to copy itself, and then that eventually built out into this larger system of the central dogma that we have in Earth life biology of the DNA, RNA, protein kind of how biology functions for life as we know it. But maybe we'll find alien life that uses a much different information system, maybe a different system for catalyzing reactions. Maybe it doesn't use amino acids to build proteins the way that our life does and builds up cellular structures with all these kinds of enzymes and stuff inside of them. And honestly, like the potential for alien life is kind of fun. One reason I love astrobiology so much is that there's so much possibility. And so you start kind of like going between the science and like the science fiction of just like dreaming of what's possible based on our knowledge of chemistry and physics.
A question I get a lot from people is, astrobiologists are always talking about life as we know it. I think you probably said that 10 times in this interview already. And they will sort of dismissively say, why aren't scientists looking for life as we don't know it? Why aren't you looking for life as we don't know it?
I would argue that a bunch of us are. And so like the whole like agnostic biosignatures, the whole idea is to look for life as we know it and life as we don't know it. So looking for like a full complement of the kinds of organic molecules that could possibly be used. And I've talked to lots of people who are like, maybe water is not the solvent for alien life. And I agree, maybe it's supercritical carbon dioxide, maybe it's liquid nitrogen. There's a lot of possible things out there that alien life could come upon for a solvent. And then also like carbon-based chemistry. The life here on Earth is carbon-based. And so people have talked for some time about the possible like silicon-based life forms that could be out there. Early Star Trek had an idea of silicon-based life in it. But there's a lot of reasons why carbon is a really good atom for being the backbone of the organic chemistry that we have. It's far more stable. The bonds are far more stable than silicon. And if you have a water-based life, that silicon bond is actually unstable in water over very long time periods. A lot of people wouldn't think that, but like it is true. Now, if you have silicon and oxygen together, like silicate, like quartz is extremely resistant to weathering. It's very stable in water, but quartz wouldn't make for great alien life, we think. And so there are other possible systems besides water, other possible backbones besides carbon, but it does seem like water and carbon are great. And so it does make sense for us to look for kind of life like that, at least in our early attempts to see life out there. But in the science fiction realm, people have thought for a long time about like how wildly alien could alien be. Could there be like an alien consciousness that we would never recognize materially by looking at samples? So like Stanislav Lem had Solaris, this idea of like a conscious planet, and the humans it was trying to communicate with them, but the humans didn't really realize that because they weren't able to understand that level of consciousness, and they weren't looking in the right way for the alien life. And certainly other science fiction authors through time have given us some really fun ideas for how alien something really could be.
Now, you're going to have to sort of check me if I get this wrong here, but life, we use 20 amino acids for a life, and like life on Earth, but there are dozens,